The midday sun over Balagan Market was not just hot, it was an angry, physical weight that pressed down on the corrugated iron roofs and the thousands of bodies jostling through the narrow alleyways. The air was thick with the smell of roasting corn, diesel fumes from struggling generators, and the sharp tang of sweating bodies. In the middle of this chaotic symphony of commerce, Emily was a ghost. At 19, her deep melanin skin was coated in a permanent layer of market dust, and her frame was gaunt, the sharp angles of her collarbones protruding painfully against her worn, oversized gray t-shirt. She sat huddled beneath the wooden display table of a fabric seller, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible to avoid the swinging hips and heavy loads of the passersby. "Get away from there, you dirty rat!" A sharp voice pierced through the noise. It was Mama Chinidu, the owner of the lace shop, wielding a broom like a weapon. "I told you if I see you near my shop again, I will pour hot water on you. You drive away my customers with your smell." Emily scrambled backward, crab-walking into the muddy path, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't speak, she hadn't spoken more than a few words in years. Instead, she clutched the one thing she owned, a necklace hidden beneath the grime of her neckline. It was an odd thing for a beggar to have, intricate coral beads, faded by time and dirt, strung together in a pattern that looked ancient and out of place against her rags. She scrambled to her feet, her dark skin glistening with sweat, and melted into the crowd, her bare feet calloused against the scorching tar. She was hungry, a gnawing, hollow pain that had become her constant companion, but today the market was too aggressive, the traders too on edge. Something was different today. The usual rhythm of haggling and shouting was punctuated by a frantic energy. Men were sweeping the main road that cut through the market, something that never happened. Police officers in crisp uniforms, not the usual weary traffic wardens, were shoving street hawkers off the curbs with batons. "Who is coming?" Emily heard a woman whisper nearby, clutching her purse tight. "King David," a man replied, his eyes wide. "The billionaire. He bought the whole Western Bloc. They say he is coming to inspect the demolition site himself. If he sees you blocking the road, his security will crush you." Emily felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the heat. She tried to move toward the safer, darker alleys behind the textile district, but the crowd was becoming a solid wall, pressing her back toward the main road. She was trapped, a piece of driftwood caught in a rising tide, unaware that the man coming to destroy the market was the same man whose blood ran silently in her veins. The air shattered. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical blow. The piercing wail of high-grade sirens cut through the market noise, instantly turning the chaotic chatter into a frantic scramble for safety. Traders abandoned their stalls, clutching their wares to their chests, while shoppers dived toward the gutters to clear the center of the road. A convoy of 6 massive, obsidian-black SUVs tore around the corner, their engines growling with a low, predatory hum that vibrated through the asphalt. They moved with terrifying precision, flanked by armed mobile police officers who hung off the sides of a pickup truck, slamming the flat of their hands against the vehicles to intimidate the crowd. "Clear the road. Move back," the security detail roared, their voices rough and amplified by bullhorns. Emily was caught in the human riptide. She tried to scramble toward the shelter of a parked delivery van, but a large woman, panicked by the approaching sirens, shoved her hard. Emily stumbled, her bare feet slipping on a patch of oil and crushed tomatoes. She hit the ground hard, her knees scraping against the rough tarmac, just as the convoy screeched to a halt mere feet from where she lay. The dust swirled around her, choking and thick, coating her eyelashes. For a terrifying moment, the world went silent, suspended in the gap between the noise of the engines dying down and the crowd holding its breath. The door of the third SUV, a bulletproof Rolls-Royce Cullinan, clicked open. The silence stretched, heavy with expectation. Then, a polished black leather shoe stepped out onto the muddy street, untouched by the filth. King David emerged, rising to his full height. He was an imposing figure, radiating an aura of absolute power. His skin was the color of deep, polished ebony, glowing with health and wealth that the people of Balagan could only dream of. He wore a pristine, starch-white agbada that flowed around him like water, embroidered with silver threads that caught the sun. On his wrist sat a diamond-encrusted timepiece worth more than the entire market block, but it was his face that commanded attention, stern, regal, and currently hidden behind dark designer sunglasses. He adjusted the heavy coral beads around his own neck, beads that mirrored the hidden ones on the girl trembling on the ground just a few yards away, and surveyed the scene with a look of distaste. He didn't see people, he saw obstacles to his construction project. He saw squalor that needed to be erased to make way for glass and steel. "Sir, the perimeter is not secure." His head of security, a burly man with a scar running down his jaw, muttered urgently, stepping close to the king. "The crowd is too thick. We should move you to the inspection point immediately." "Relax, Tund." King David's voice was a deep baritone, calm and unbothered by the chaos surrounding him. "They are just looking. Let them look. It is the last time they will see this place as a slum." Emily, terrified to look up but unable to move, curled into a ball. She was exposed, lying in the open strip of road reserved for the king, separated from the crushing crowd by a line of nervous police officers. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hand instinctively flying to her throat to clutch her own beads, praying to be invisible, praying that the boots marching toward her would simply step over her and leave her be. "Get this trash out of the king's path. Are you mad?" Tund barked, his patience snapping like a dry twig. He didn't wait for his subordinates to act, he lunged forward himself. His massive hand, encased in a tactical glove, clamped down on Emily's frail shoulder with the force of a hydraulic press. Emily let out a sharp, ragged gasp, flinching as she was hauled upward like a rag doll. She didn't fight, she had learned long ago that resistance only invited harder blows. Her legs dragged uselessly against the asphalt, her feet leaving trails in the muck as the security chief prepared to toss her into the crowd like a sack of spoiled vegetables. "Please," she whimpered, the word barely a breath, her hands flying up instinctively to protect her chest rather than her face. I am going. "You should have gone long ago." Tund growled, winding up to shove her toward the gutter. In the violence of the motion, the neckline of Emily's oversized, rot-thin gray t-shirt snagged on Tund's wristwatch. With a sickening rip, the fabric tore open down the front, exposing her collarbones and the upper part of her chest to the harsh afternoon sun. The movement froze the king. King David had been turning away, gesturing for his architects to bring the blueprints, when a flash of distinctive, blood-red color caught his peripheral vision. It wasn't the red of the warning lights or the red of the dirt. It was a specific lustrous shade of deep organic crimson that he hadn't seen in 15 agonizing years. "Stop!" The command thunderclapped from David's chest, so loud and authoritative that it didn't just stop Tund, it seemed to halt the wind itself. Tund froze mid-shove, Emily dangling from his grip, her feet barely touching the ground. "Sir? She is just a..." I said, "Unhand her." David didn't walk. He stormed forward, the water-like grace of his agbada vanishing, replaced by the terrifying intensity of a father who recognizes a ghost. He ignored the mud splashing onto his Italian loafers. He ignored the security detail forming a nervous circle around him. His eyes were locked on the object swinging frantically against the girl's dark, sweat-streaked skin. It was a necklace of royal iron, ancient coral beads. But not just any coral. These were carved in the distinct, spiraling pattern of the royal house of Adeyemi, capped with tiny, distinct gold clasps that were shaped like lion heads. There was only one such necklace in existence, commissioned for a princess on her naming day. David reached out, his hand trembling visibly, shocking the onlookers who viewed him as a man of stone. He didn't touch her skin. He touched the beads, lifting them with a tenderness that contradicted the violence of the moment. The girl flinched, expecting a strike, squeezing her eyes shut as tears cut clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Where?" David's voice broke, the billionaire tycoon dissolving into a desperate man. "Where did you get these beads?" Emily opened her eyes, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She looked up at the towering figure in white, terrified by the intensity in his gaze. My papa," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He gave it to me before the fire," he said. "He said I must never take it off." The world tilted on its axis for King David. The fire. The coup. The night his palace burned and his 4-year-old daughter was taken by a fleeing nanny who never made it to the safe house. He looked at her face, really looked at it. Beneath the grime, the gauntness, and the mask of poverty, he saw the curve of her jaw. It was his mother's jaw. He saw the shape of her eyes. They were his own. The collective gasp of 500 people sucked the air out of the market. It started as a low murmur of confusion and escalated into a wave of disbelief as King David, the man who owned half the skyline of Lagos, released his grip on the beads but did not step back. Instead, his knees buckled. He didn't fall from weakness. He descended with the heavy, deliberate gravity of a collapsing building. His knees hit the black oil-slicked slush of the market road with a wet thud, instantly soaking the pristine white fabric of his agbada in filth. "Sir." "No, sir." Tund lunged forward, horrified, his training screaming that the principal was having a medical emergency. "Medic! Get the medic!" "Back!" David roared, swinging an arm back blindly to ward off his guards without taking his eyes off Emily. The command was so feral, so unlike his usual composed corporate demeanor, that the security team skidded to a halt, weapons half-raised, unsure of who the enemy was. David placed his manicured hands flat on the dirty asphalt, bowing his head until his forehead was inches from Emily's bruised, dust-caked toes. The posture was unmistakable. It wasn't just an apology, it was dabail, the supreme act of submission and respect in Yoruba culture, a gesture a king performed for no one, certainly not a market rat. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying in its intensity. The only sound was the hum of the idling Rolls-Royce and the ragged, panicked breathing of the girl standing above him. Emily pressed her back against the rough metal of the delivery van, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed the fear of being beaten. Madness. She decided the man was mad. Rich men often went mad when the spirits they used for money rituals came to collect. She trembled, waiting for him to look up, for the spell to break, for the anger to return. Slowly, David lifted his head. Tears, unbidden and unchecked, streamed from behind his dark sunglasses, prompting him to rip them off and cast them aside into the gutter. His eyes were red, raw with a decade and a half of grief. "I have looked in London," he choked out, his voice thick and wet. "I have looked in America. I have dug up graves in the north. And you? You were sleeping under a table in my own city." He reached out again, not to the beads this time, but to her hands. He took her rough, calloused, dirt-stained fingers into his soft palms. "Omalara," he whispered, using a name she hadn't heard since the smoke took her memory. "My princess. My blood. Forgive me. I am late. I am so late." The crowd erupted. The whispers turned into shouts of hysteria. Traders were pulling out phones, recording the impossible sight of the oil king weeping at the feet of the mute beggar girl. The barrier of reality had broken, and no one knew how to process the scene before them. "Secure the perimeter. We are compromised. Move." Tun's voice cut through the emotional haze like a serrated knife. The crowd was surging forward, driven by a morbid, frenzied curiosity to touch the hem of the drama unfolding before them. What was a sacred reunion seconds ago was rapidly turning into a security nightmare. The human wall of onlookers was collapsing inward, hundreds of phones thrust into the air like spears, recording every sob and every stain. David rose to his feet, ignoring the heavy cakes of black mud clinging to his knees. He didn't bother to wipe his hands or address the gawking masses. Instead, he stripped off his heavy, hand-embroidered agbada robe. With a sweeping motion, he wrapped the thick white fabric around Emily's shivering, exposed shoulders, covering her torn shirt and her filth with a garment worth more than the shop she slept behind. She flinched at the sudden weight of it, the scent of expensive oud cologne and crisp starch overwhelming the stale smell of refuse she was accustomed to. I can walk, Emily stammered, her legs shaking violently, her eyes darting between the assault rifles and the shouting men. I don't want trouble. You will never walk in the dirt again unless you choose to, David vowed, his voice steel-hard, vibrating with a terrifying resolve. He didn't wait for her permission. He swept her up into his arms, bridal style. She was alarmingly light, a featherweight burden of hollow bones and malnutrition that made a fresh wave of fury rise in his chest, fury at the world that had starved his child while he feasted in banquets. The security team formed a tight phalanx, a wedge of black suits and hard muscles clearing a path to the Rolls-Royce. Back! Give way! They screamed, shoving phones and grasping hands aside with aggressive force. David carried her to the open door of the SUV, moving as if he carried a fragile porcelain vase through a war zone. The interior was a different universe, cream leather, deep pile carpets, and cool, conditioned air that chilled the sweat on Emily's skin instantly. He placed her gently on the seat, ignoring how the grime from her legs smeared onto the pristine upholstery. He climbed in beside her and pulled the heavy door shut. The sound of the outside world, the shouting, the engines, the chaos, was instantly decapitated, replaced by a vacuum of hermetically sealed silence and the soft, barely perceptible purr of the V12 engine. Emily pressed her spine against the door, eyes wide, looking at the man who claimed to be her father. She was trapped in a glass box, watching the market blur as the convoy accelerated, moving away from the only hell she knew into a heaven she didn't trust. Drive, David commanded, staring straight ahead, his hand gripping hers so tight his knuckles turned ash gray, refusing to let go even for a second. Take us to the Banana Island estate. And call Dr. Ballaghan. Tell him to meet us there. Now. The convoy didn't just park, it docked like a fleet of ships returning to a fortress. The heavy, automated iron gates of the Banana Island estate swung open silently, admitting the vehicles into a world that felt fundamentally different from the one they had left 20 minutes ago. Here, there was no dust. The air didn't smell of diesel and sweat, it smelled of manicured hibiscus hedges, ocean salt, and the sterile, metallic scent of extreme security. As the Rolls-Royce came to a halt in front of the white limestone portico, the contrast was violent. Emily looked out the tinted window at the pristine driveway, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a stain entering a painting, a smudge of charcoal on a fresh canvas. David opened the door, the cool air of the island rushing in. He didn't wait for the chauffeur. He extended his hand, and Emily took it, her fingers leaving faint muddy prints on his palm. As she stepped out, the oversized white Agbada trailed behind her like a royal train, sweeping the driveway. She took a step and almost collapsed, her legs turning to jelly not from exhaustion, but from the sheer vertigo of the scale of the house. It wasn't a home, it was a monument. Pillars the size of ancient trees held up a roof that seemed to scrape the sky, and the front doors were massive slabs of mahogany that could have guarded a cathedral. "Welcome home," David said, the words heavy with a promise she didn't quite understand. He guided her up the steps, his hand firm on the small of her back, propelling her forward when her instinct shouted at her to run back to the gutter. The double doors swung open, revealed by a steward in a crisp white uniform who struggled to keep his face neutral. They stepped into the foyer, a cavernous space dominated by a dual staircase and a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of crystals. The floor was Italian marble, polished to a mirror finish. Emily stopped dead. She looked down and saw her own reflection in the floor, a wild, ragged thing with matted hair and dirt-streaked skin, standing next to a man who looked like a god. She instinctively curled her toes, trying to lift her feet off the floor to avoid dirtying the white stone, balancing awkwardly on her heels. "Mrs. Adebayo." David's voice boomed through the hall, bouncing off the high ceilings. A severe-looking woman in a black suit materialized from a side corridor, followed by two younger maids. She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening behind her spectacles as she took in the scene: the mud on the floor, the disheveled king, and the waif wrapped in his ceremonial robes. "My king," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Prepare the guest wing." "The master suite," David corrected himself, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And get the bath running. Warm, not hot. Rose oil and antiseptic. Now." "But, sir, the master suite it's for the princess," Mrs. Adebayo stammered, confused. The room had been kept locked and dusted for 15 years, a shrine to a memory. "Exactly," David snapped, turning his gaze back to Emily, who was trembling by a marble pillar. "The owner has returned. Open it." Emily shrank back as the maids bustled forward, their eyes darting over her with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. She felt naked despite the heavy robe. In the market, she was invisible. Here, she was a specimen under a microscope. She looked at a massive gilded mirror on the wall and saw the truth of what she was. She wasn't a princess. She was a mistake. A dirty, broken thing that had wandered into a palace. Tears welled up in her eyes, hot and stinging, as the reality of her filth clashed with the pristine perfection of her father's empire. The double doors to the master suite groaned open, revealing a space that felt less like a bedroom and more like a suspended breath. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lavender sachets that had been replaced weekly for 15 years by staff who never questioned why. It was a time capsule of a 4-year-old's fantasy. A canopy bed draped in cascades of rose gold mosquito netting, shelves lined with porcelain dolls whose glass eyes stared blindly into the dark, and a rocking horse carved from mahogany that stood frozen in mid-gallop near the window. Emily stopped at the threshold, her muddy feet sinking into the plush, cream-colored carpet. The contrast was grotesque. She looked at the dolls, pristine and perfect, and then at her own hands, scarred and blackened by years of digging through trash. She felt like a contagion entering a sterile lab. I can't sit there," she whispered, backing away from the silk bedspread, terrified she would stain it with her mere existence. "You will sit where you please." "It is yours," David said softly, guiding her toward a velvet chaise lounge instead. Before she could protest further, the heavy thud of rapid footsteps echoed from the hallway. Dr. Ballaghan burst in, a short, energetic man carrying a battered leather medical bag, breathless from sprinting up the marble stairs. He stopped short, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second as he took in the emaciated figure huddled on the velvet. He didn't ask questions. The king's face told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a social call, it was a rescue mission. "Clear the room," Ballaghan ordered the hovering maids, his voice snapping with clinical authority. "David, you too. I need to assess the damage." "I am not leaving," David stated, crossing his arms, planting his feet like roots in the floor. "I lost her once. I am not letting her out of my sight." Ballaghan didn't argue. He approached Emily slowly, treating her like a wild animal that might bite. "Hello, my dear. I'm going to just look at your hands, okay? Just the hands." As the doctor began to work, peeling away the layers of grime with antiseptic wipes, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. With every layer of dirt removed, a map of suffering was revealed. David watched in horror as the wipes turned black, unveiling old cigarette burns on her forearms, jagged white lines from falls on concrete, and the distinct, rope texture of malnutrition that made her skin cling too tightly to her bones. But it was when Ballaghan gently lifted the hem of the oversized Igbata to check her ankles that the air left the room. Her ankles were swollen, marked by deep, circular indentations, scars that could only have come from being chained or tied with wire for long periods. David let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, turning away to punch the wall. The sound of his fist hitting the plaster cracked the silence. He had been building skyscrapers while someone had been tying his daughter up like a dog. The guilt was not a weight. It was a physical acid burning through his chest. She is severely dehydrated, anemically critical, and shows signs of long-term calcium deficiency, Balogun murmured, his voice low, hiding the worst of it. David, this is not just poverty. This is torture. She has survived things that would have killed grown men. David retreated to the balcony, the glass doors shutting behind him to give the women privacy, though he refused to go further than the threshold. Inside the bathroom, which was the size of a small apartment, the air was thick with steam and the cloying scent of imported bath salts. Mrs. Adebayo, the housekeeper who had managed the estate with an iron fist for 2 decades, now stood trembling by the oversized porcelain tub. She beckoned the younger maids forward, their hands shaking as they prepared to strip away the rags that had fused to the girl's identity. Gently, Mrs. Adebayo whispered, her voice cracking. She is not a doll. She is flesh and blood. When the remains of the oversized gray t-shirt were peeled away, falling to the tiled floor with a wet slap, the room seemed to hold its breath. Emily stood shivering in the steam, her ribs counting themselves out against her skin, her spine a jagged ridge of bone. She wrapped her arms around herself, not out of modesty, but out of a deep-seated instinct to protect her vital organs. She stared at the water, frothy with bubbles, and terrified eyes darted to the housekeeper. Is the water hot? Emily asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the extractor fan. Mama Chinidi used to pour hot water on the dogs. Mrs. Adebayo let out a strangled sob, clapping a hand over her mouth to stifle the noise. No, my child. It is warm. Like the sun. They guided her into the tub. As Emily sank into the water, a cloud of dark silt instantly began to bloom around her, turning the pristine, rose-scented foam into a murky gray swamp. She sat rigid, expecting the water to burn, but instead, it enveloped her in a heat that reached deep into her frozen marrow. For the first time in years, her muscles, perpetually coiled for flight, began to unravel. Mrs. Adebayo took a soft sponge, lathering it with soap that smelled of lavender and money. She began to scrub, starting at Emily's neck. The friction was gentle, but the result was shocking. Years of market soot, road dust, and defensive grime began to slough off. As the gray water washed away, the girl's true skin tone emerged, a rich, luminous deep melanin that had been hidden under a mask of poverty. The transformation was slow and agonizingly intimate. With every stroke of the sponge, they weren't just washing a body, they were excavating a human being from the debris of a lost life. You are beautiful, one of the younger maids whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks as she washed Emily's hair, the water running brown and then clear, revealing tight, neglected curls. You look just like the portrait in the hallway. Emily didn't answer. She was watching the water turn black, fascinated and horrified that so much darkness had been living on her skin. She felt lighter, stripped of her armor, vulnerable in a way that was more terrifying than the streets. Cleanliness was a luxury she didn't know how to wear. The grand dining room was a cavern of mahogany and gold leaf, illuminated by a chandelier that cast a warm, honeyed glow over the table set for 12. Yet, only 2 chairs were occupied. Emily sat at the far end, dwarfed by the high-backed velvet chair, wearing a set of oversized silk pajamas that felt like water against her skin. She looked at the spread before her, a mountain of jollof rice, grilled croaker fish, fried plantains, and bowls of pepper soup, and felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't hunger, it was panic. In the market, food was a war. You fought for it, you hid it, and you ate it in the shadows before someone bigger took it away. Here, it was displayed like an art piece, vulnerable and open. David sat to her right, having abandoned the head of the table to be closer to her. He had changed into a simple black caftan, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of the daughter he remembered. He watched her pick up the heavy silver fork, her hand trembling. The metal clinked loudly against the fine china, the sound echoing in the silent room like a gunshot. "You don't have to use the fork, Emily," David said softly, pushing his own cutlery away. "This is your house. You eat however you want." Emily didn't look up. She stared at a piece of fried chicken on her plate. Slowly, her eyes darted to the stewards standing like statues by the doors. The instinct kicked in, the primal rewiring of the brain that happens after a decade of starvation. In a blur of motion, she snatched the chicken leg. But instead of bringing it to her mouth, her hand shot under the table. She shoved the greasy, hot meat deep into the pocket of her silk pajama trousers. David froze. The stewards shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should intervene. "Emily?" David asked, his voice cracking with confusion. She flinched, pulling her hand back up, empty and glistening with oil. "For later," she whispered, her eyes wide and terrified, staring at the tablecloth. For when you tell me to leave. I need to save it." The sentence hit David like a physical blow to the stomach. He realized then that the bath had washed away the dirt, but it hadn't touched the wiring of her survival. She was still in the market. She was still expecting the eviction, the broom, the shouting. She was hoarding calories against a future she believed was inevitable. David stood up slowly. He picked up the entire platter of chicken from the center of the table. He didn't serve her. He walked over to her chair, knelt on the expensive Persian rug, and placed the silver platter directly on her lap. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice thick with emotion. When she finally met his gaze, he gestured to the room, the food, the house. "You will never have to save food again. If you want to fill your pockets, fill them. If you want to fill your room, we will fill it. But no one is sending you away. You are the owner of the bread. You don't beg for crumbs in your own kitchen." He took a piece of chicken and bit into it with his hands, oil dripping onto his expensive kaftan, shattering the etiquette of the dining room to show her that the rules no longer applied. "Please, just eat." The heavy oak doors of the private library clicked shut, sealing out the emotional humidity of the rest of the house. Here, the air was refrigerated and smelled of leather bindings and cold, hard justice. King David walked to his desk, a massive slab of petrified wood, and poured himself a glass of amber whiskey, his hands steady but his eyes burning with a glacial fury. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the liquid, watching the light fracture through the crystal, thinking of the chicken legs staining the pocket of his daughter's silk pajamas. "Talk," David commanded, not turning around. From the shadows of the room, Tund stepped forward. The head of security looked exhausted, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing a tablet clutched in his hand like a weapon. "We ran a retrospective trace, sir. We pulled the footage from the Plaza Project surveillance drones. We also interrogated the market woman, Mama Chinidu." David turned slowly, the glass clinking against the wood as he set it down. "And?" "She knew," Tund said, his voice dropping an octave. "She didn't know the girl was a princess, but she knew Emily wasn't just a stray. 15 years ago, a woman dropped the child off at the market dump site. She paid the local area boys to ensure the child didn't leave the sector, but also that she didn't die. Just existed. In purgatory." "The nanny," David hissed, the word tasting like poison. "Funk." "Yes, sir. We thought she died in the ambush. We found a body in the wreckage." Tund tapped the tablet, projecting a hologram of a bank statement into the air above the desk. "But dead women don't open offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands 3 days after a coup. Funk is alive. She has been living in Abuja under the name Madame Gold, running a chain of high-end bakeries." The silence in the room was louder than a scream. The woman entrusted with his daughter's life hadn't just failed. She had sold the child like livestock to save her own skin, funding a life of luxury while the princess slept in the mud. The betrayal was so absolute, so wrought deep, that David felt a vein throb dangerously in his temple. "She is in Abuja?" David asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Yes, sir. She is hosting a charity gala tonight. Ironically, for orphans." David picked up the whiskey glass and hurled it against the far wall. The crystal shattered with a violent crash, shards raining down onto the expensive carpet. Prepare the jet. I want her picked up. Not arrested. Picked up. Bag her. If she screams, let her scream. Bring her to the soundproof holding cell in the basement. I want to ask her personally how much my daughter's life was worth. Tund nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. And the sponsor? The one who paid her? She will tell us, David promised, buttoning his suit jacket with terrifying precision. She will tell us everything before the sun rises. The basement of the Banana Island estate was a stark contradiction to the marble and gold above. It was a windowless cube of reinforced concrete, soundproofed and cold, lit by a single humming fluorescent strip that drained the color from everything it touched. Funk, known to the Abuja elite as Madame Gold, sat zip-tied to a steel chair bolted to the floor. Her transformation from the belle of the charity ball to a prisoner was jarring. Her expensive burnt orange lace asubi was torn at the shoulder, her heavy makeup smeared by sweat and terror, and her gold gelly lay unraveled on the floor like a dead snake. The heavy steel door hissed open. King David walked in, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't bring guards. He didn't bring weapons. He brought only a small velvet pouch. He pulled a chair opposite her, sitting down with a terrifying, heavy calmness. He didn't speak. He simply reached into the pouch and pulled out the faded, dirt-encrusted coral necklace with the lion head clasps. He placed it gently on the metal table between them. Funk stopped breathing. Her eyes bulged, fixed on the beads as if they were radioactive. The silence in the room stretched until it was a physical weight, pressing against her eardrums. I can explain, she croaked, her voice trembling, stripping away the polished accent she had cultivated over the years. Explain, David asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the small room. Explain how you took a 4-year-old child, entrusted to your care during a fire, and dropped her in Balagan Market like a bag of refuse? Explain how you watched me mourn for 15 years while you baked cakes. I couldn't kill her. Funk blurted out, tears of hysteria streaming down her face. He told me to kill her. He said if there was an heir, he could never take the title. But I couldn't do it. I looked at her eyes and I couldn't. So I hit her. I thought if she was lost in the market, she would just disappear. Who? David's question was a blade. Who paid you enough to sell your soul? Funk clamped her mouth shut, shaking her head violently. He will kill me. He is powerful, David. You don't understand. David leaned forward, his face inches from hers. Look at me. You are worried about a man? I am the father who found his child eating from the floor. There is no hell worse than what I will bring to you if you do not give me a name. Funk sobbed, her resistance crumbling under the weight of his grief and fury. She slumped in the chair, defeated. Rodamai, she whispered. It was your brother, Rodamai. He said the throne was his birthright, but Omalara stood in the way. David sat back, the air leaving his lungs. His own blood. The brother who had held his hand at the funeral service for the dead princess. The brother who sat on the board of his company. The betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back, it was a rot in the family tree. He stood up, picking up the beads. He didn't touch Funk. He didn't need to. He tapped the intercom on the wall. Tund, he said, his voice void of emotion. She has confessed. Record it. Then hand her over to the police. And Tund, send the convoy to my brother's house. Wake him up. 3 months later, the scar on the earth that was the old market block had vanished. In its place stood the Omalara Towers, a monolith of glass and steel that reflected the Lagos sky. But today, the focus was not on the architecture. A massive stage had been erected at the base of the tower, draped in the royal colors of emerald and gold. The crowd that gathered was different this time, a mixture of the city's elite in their stiff damask robes and the market women who had once chased a beggar girl away, now standing behind velvet ropes, hushed and expectant. King David stood at the podium. He looked younger, the crushing weight of grief finally lifted from his shoulders. His brother, Rotamai, was gone, erased from the family narrative and awaiting trial in a cell far less comfortable than the one in the basement. The purge had been swift and absolute. Today was about restoration. Years ago, this ground was a place of struggle. David's voice boomed over the speakers, clear and strong. I came here to build a building. Instead, I found the foundation of my life. He turned to the heavy curtains behind him. People of Lagos, I do not present to you a survivor. I present to you your future, the rightful heir to the Adeyemi dynasty. The curtains parted. Emily, now fully Princess Omalara, stepped into the sunlight. The transformation was absolute. The emaciated ghost was gone. In her place stood a young woman of striking poise, her skin glowing with health and expensive oils. She wore a dress of hand-woven aso oak, deep emerald green embroidered with gold threads that shimmered like liquid fire. Her hair, once matted and hidden, was styled in an elaborate, high-braided crown, woven with fresh coral beads. She walked to the front of the stage. Her legs, once weak and scarred, moved with a steady, practiced grace. She looked out at the sea of faces. She spotted Mama Chinedu in the crowd, the woman's face a mask of shame and awe. Omalara didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She held the woman's gaze until the shopkeeper lowered her eyes to the floor in submission. David stepped to her side, holding a velvet cushion. On it sat not a diamond tiara, but a simple, heavy headpiece made of pure, unpolished coral, the Queen Mother's crown. "My daughter," David said, his voice soft just for her. "You survived the fire. You survived the street. You survived the silence. This kingdom is the least you deserve." He didn't bow this time. Instead, he lifted the crown and placed it gently on her head. It was heavy, a physical reminder of the burden of power, but Omalara's neck did not bend. She stood tall, absorbing the weight. She reached up, touching the cool stones, and then moved her hand down to the old, faded necklace she still wore beneath her royal attire, the one link between the girl who slept under the table and the woman who now owned the block. For the first time in 15 years, she smiled, not a shy, fearful twitch, but a radiant, blinding expression of victory. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, echoing off the glass tower that bore her name. "I am Omalara Adeyemi," she declared, her voice carrying over the rooftops of Balagan. "And I am finally home." The applause that followed didn't just break the silence, it shook the city. Please, kindly hit the subscribe button, like this video and share. This means a lot to us. Thank you for watching.